Hey guys, welcome to part two of Russian history. Hope you enjoyed part one. So we're talking about the history because in order to understand today, you gotta know the past. You gotta know what's on people's minds. Um, what's past often affects our decisions about the future. So let's check out part two. We got up to World War II. Um, Before we do that, let's just recap our essential questions. So we're doing the history, but our unit is going to focus on these questions about the present. Should the United States view Russia as a potential partner, a tough rival, or a growing threat? How do Russian policies affect the United States? And what policies should the United States make to manage its relationship with Russia? So in the past, we have been partners, we've been tough rivals, and we've been had threats between us. So what's it going to be today? Um, After the World War II, in which Russia and the U.S. emerge as the world superpowers, Russia does something that became known as the Iron Curtain. The Iron Curtain is this line between the red and the blue. So as Russia defeated the Germans, they never withdrew their troops from all of these countries. They kept them there. And they kept them there so that they didn't like conquer the countries, but they kept them there to influence and affect the country's belongings. So these countries would have their own governments, but Russia would heavily influence the governments. So they called it a realm of Soviet influence, or they called it the Soviet bloc. Um, so that was known as the Iron Country. There were often troops along this border, and nobody was allowed to come or go, or few people were. You had to be checked. It wasn't a free border. So in 1946, the Cold War starts, and there's this diplomat in Moscow, an American diplomat named Keenan. He sent a document to the State Department who said, hey, the Soviet system is paranoid and hostile towards the outside world. The U.S. should seek to contain the expansion of the Soviet Union, that the Soviet Union wanted to expand communism. And Keenan got this idea because the Soviet Union kept all their troops in those Eastern and Central European countries. Like they wanted to expand the communist influence into those countries. Now, here in this cartoon, you see the U.S. is Uncle Sam, and the Soviet Union is depicted as a bear. And this was a symbol that was used throughout the 20th century, that the Soviet Union was the bear. And it's still used sometimes today to depict Russia. So, President Truman came up with something, this was right after World War II, called the Truman Doctrine, and it was about containment. And we were going to contain the spread of Soviet communism. So there were three things there. Number one, there was aid to Turkey and Greece. And number two, there was the Marshall Plan, which was we were going to help rebuild all of Europe that had been destroyed in the war. So we lent $130 billion to reconstruct 16 different European countries. And we created something called NATO, along with our allies in Western Europe, 13 countries. We pledged to defend any of those countries if the Soviet Union attacked, and if anybody attacked us, those countries would help us. So it was an alliance to deter Soviet aggression. We kept like 400,000 troops in Europe, and we still have today 34,000 in Germany. So they've been there for 60, 70 years. Now, this cartoon shows what some people were feeling at the time that Truman announced this. If you can see Uncle Sam, he's walking out on this limb. It says New American Foreign Policy. He's using his cane. He's blindfolded, so he doesn't know how it's going to go. So people were nervous about the new policy, but nevertheless, Truman put it into place to contain Soviet communism. After Truman, President Eisenhower took it a step further. The Soviet Union started to develop its own stockpile of nuclear weapons. And prior to that, we were the only country with nukes. But Soviet Union started building them. And the Soviet bloc in all the Soviet troops in Eastern Europe had people worried. So we started building our own nuclear arsenal. We built it up to 400, and we vowed to use them if the Soviet attacked any NATO country. So that's the idea of massive retaliation. If you attack us, it will be a massive counterattack, and we will wipe you out with nuclear weapons. Now, war does almost break out. The Soviet Union tries to put some nuclear weapons in Cuba, who was one of their allies. And President Kennedy, this is in the 1960s, ended up blockading the island of Cuba. But it was a real tense couple of weeks where a lot of people thought nuclear war was going to break out. Fortunately, it did not. Okay, by the late 1960s and 1970s, President Nixon, he was really a big-time anti-communist, but he thought things needed to calm down a little bit, like tensions were a little high between us and the Soviet Union. So he came up with something called the détente. And by the way, some of the reasons he thought tensions were high, there had been a war against communists in North Korea. There had been a war against communists in Vietnam. So there had been a couple of wars and a lot of Americans had died. Nixon wanted to calm things down. So détente means relaxation of tensions. So Nixon wanted to produce some rules for superpower conduct, and he wanted to prevent international crises. And you can see this cartoon. Some people thought at the time that Nixon was dancing. This symbol is the Soviet symbol. It's a sickle and a hammer. A sickle is what you use to gather wheat. Like before they had big farm machinery, they used a sickle. So Nixon was dancing with the Russians, and the Russians were trampling over the rights of dissidents. This word down here says dissident. I don't know if you can see it on your screen, but there were dead bodies that they were dancing upon. So some people didn't like the détente, like this cartoonist, but a lot of people in the U.S. thought it was a good idea. Nixon thought it was a good idea. Along comes Mikhail Gorbachev in the mid-'80s or early '80s. Some things that happened before Gorbachev. Gorbachev's a famous Russian leader. There was the détente, but then in the late '70s, the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan, and Ronald Reagan comes to power in 1980, and Ronald Reagan vows to fight the communists a little more fiercely. So the détente is fading away. The Soviet industry, the science, their military was all in decline. Communism wasn't working. By the 1970s, 80s, communism was starting to show its weaknesses as an economic system. It was failing. So Gorbachev comes on and he says he's going to have some reforms. He wants to reduce the use of alcohol. He wants to open up the economy to Western technology investment. And he allows Eastern European countries to regain their freedom. So they start having these revolts in places like Poland and Hungary, and he does not use the military to crush the revolts, which previous Soviet presidents had done. So it's a huge thing that he does, is let these countries get their freedom. By the way, just if you ever hear the words perestroika and glasnost, those are the names of his economic reforms. So with Gorbachev, the Soviet Union ends up collapsing. Its economy was failing. Countries were leaving the Soviet Union. Hardline communists tried to take back over. They led a coup, but the coup fails. Nevertheless, Gorbachev is weakened, and he lets the Soviet Union dissolve into 15 different republics. The biggest republic is Russia. You can see it on this map again. All of these other colored countries were Soviet republics or were Soviet states, and now they get their freedom. In fact, these three gray countries right here were also Soviet republics, Soviet states that now get their freedom. So that's the story of the Soviet Union. It came in 1917. It dissolved in 1990 or 91. And now we have Russia. And Russia is the biggest country left from the Soviet Union. That's it for today. If you have any questions, let me know. See me in class or email me.